In 1889, over 300 babies were born in a single hospital ward in New York City. Not one of them received a birth certificate. Not one of them was ever officially recorded as existing. Today, we know why. The Blackwell's Island Hospital stood like a fortress against the East River's dark waters. Its brick walls held secrets that would make even the bravest soul question the nature of human compassion. This was no ordinary maternity ward. This was where society sent the women they wanted to forget. The year was 1889. New York City pulsed with the energy of progress. Yet beneath its shining surface lay a darker truth. On a narrow strip of land between Manhattan and Queens, Blackwell's Island housed the city's most desperate cases. The insane, the criminal, the diseased, and the unmarried mothers. Dr. Helena Morrison arrived at Blackwell's Island Hospital on a cold October morning, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hand. She had been hired as one of the few female physicians allowed to work in the maternity ward. What she would discover there would haunt her for the rest of her life. The ward itself was a study in controlled desperation. Long rows of iron beds lined the walls, each occupied by a woman whose story the outside world refused to hear. These were not the wives of merchants or the daughters of respected families. These were servants, immigrants, and women who had fallen from society's grace. Women whose pregnancies brought shame rather than celebration. Dr. Morrison's journal, discovered in 1987 in a trunk in her granddaughter's attic, provides our window into this forgotten world. Her first entry reads simply, "They told me I would be delivering babies. They never told me I would be delivering ghosts." The hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Charles Whitmore, was a man whose reputation preceded him. Tall and severe, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of every person they fell upon, he ran the maternity ward with military precision. But precision, Dr. Morrison would learn, was not the same as compassion. On her third day, Dr. Morrison witnessed something that would change her understanding of medicine forever. A young Irish girl, no more than 17, had been in labor for nearly 20 hours. The girl's screams echoed through the ward, but no family members waited in the halls. No husband paced nervously outside. She was alone, as they all were. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and crying, Dr. Morrison expected the usual procedures: the weighing, the cleaning, the paperwork. Instead, she watched as Dr. Whitmore took the infant from her hands and disappeared through a door she had never seen opened. "Where does he take them?" she asked Nurse Margaret Kelly, a weathered woman who had worked the ward for 15 years. Nurse Kelly's response was barely a whisper. "Best not to ask questions here, doctor. Best just to do your job and go home." But Dr. Morrison was not the type of woman to accept easy answers. That night, she returned to the hospital under cover of darkness. What she would discover would challenge everything she believed about the medical profession. The basement of Blackwell's Island Hospital contained a wing that did not appear on any official blueprints. Behind a heavy wooden door, she found rows upon rows of cribs. But these cribs were not filled with crying infants. They were filled with silence. The truth, as Dr. Morrison would document in increasingly frantic journal entries, was more horrifying than she could have imagined. The babies born in the unmarked ward were not being given to families. They were not being placed for adoption. They were being sold. Dr. Whitmore had created a system as efficient as it was cruel. Wealthy families who could not have children of their own would pay substantial sums for healthy infants. But these were not legal adoptions. These were transactions that existed in the shadows, away from the eyes of the law. The mothers, weak from childbirth and often sedated with laudanum, were told their babies had died. Birth certificates were forged with practiced ease. The women, having no legal standing due to their unmarried status, had no recourse. Society had already judged them unworthy. Now the medical system had rendered them powerless. But the selling of babies was only part of Dr. Whitmore's operation. Some infants, those deemed imperfect or simply surplus to demand, met an even darker fate. Dr. Morrison's journal entry from November 15, 1889 is almost too painful to read. Found them today. 7 small bodies in the medical college's specimen room. 7 souls who never drew breath long enough to be missed. The medical colleges of New York had an insatiable appetite for anatomical specimens. Bodies for dissection were in constant demand, and few asked questions about where they originated. Newborn infants, Dr. Morrison realized with growing horror, were particularly valuable for teaching purposes. If you're watching from anywhere in the world where medical ethics are taken seriously today, drop your location in the comments. Let's see how global our community really is. As winter settled over Blackwell's Island, Dr. Morrison began to document everything: names, dates, descriptions of the procedures. She sketched the layout of the secret basement ward. She recorded conversations, noting Dr. Whitmore's callous remarks about cleaning up society's mistakes. The women who gave birth in the ward came from every corner of the city's underclass. Mary O'Sullivan, a 16-year-old who had worked as a seamstress until her condition became obvious. Elizabeth Romano, an Italian immigrant whose husband had disappeared the moment he learned of her pregnancy. Sarah Washington, a former slave who had come north seeking freedom, but found only different chains. Each woman's story was unique, but their fates were depressingly similar. They would give birth in pain and fear, be told their children had died, and then be released back into a world that offered them no support or sympathy. Many never recovered from the experience. Some, Dr. Morrison noted, never left the island at all. The hospital's records, as they were, told a different story. Officially, the maternity ward had a tragically high infant mortality rate. Nearly 90% of babies born there were recorded as dying within hours of birth. To outside observers, this might have seemed as a reflection of the poor conditions and limited medical knowledge of the time. Dr. Morrison knew better. She had seen the healthy babies taken away. She had watched Dr. Whitmore's careful selection process. She understood that the mortality statistics were not a reflection of medical failure, but of moral corruption. By December of 1889, Dr. Morrison had gathered enough evidence to expose the entire operation. Her journal entries from this period show a woman wrestling with her conscience. She knew that speaking out would end her career and possibly put her life in danger. But she also knew that remaining silent made her complicit in an ongoing atrocity. The breaking point came on December 23rd, when a young woman named Catherine Murphy gave birth to twins. Dr. Morrison watched as Dr. Whitmore separated the infants, taking the healthy boy to his private office while leaving the weaker girl in the ward. When Dr. Morrison checked on the girl hours later, she found the crib empty. Natural causes, Dr. Whitmore explained when questioned. The weak one rarely survive long. But Dr. Morrison had seen the girl breathing strongly just hours before. She had seen the clear eyes and heard the lusty cry. There was nothing natural about what had happened. That night, Dr. Morrison wrote her most damning journal entry. I can no longer be party to this evil. Tomorrow, I will gather my evidence and present it to the authorities. If they will not listen, I will find someone who will. These women deserve justice. These children deserve to be remembered. However, Dr. Morrison never got the chance to expose the truth. On December 24, 1889, she was found dead in her apartment, apparently having succumbed to a sudden illness. The coroner's report cited heart failure, but her journal suggests a different cause. Her final entry, dated December 23rd, reads, "Dr. Whitmore knows I have been investigating. He has made veiled threats about the dangers facing overly curious physicians. I have hidden my journal and evidence in a place where they will be safe. If something happens to me, perhaps someday the truth will still emerge." With Dr. Morrison's death, the secret of the unmarked ward might have remained buried forever. Dr. Whitmore continued his operations for several more years until changes in city administration and increased scrutiny of the island's facilities forced him to close the maternity ward entirely in 1894. The official records state that the ward was closed due to budget constraints and declining need. The truth, as Dr. Morrison's journal reveals, was that too many people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. In the years following the ward's closure, stories began to circulate among New York's immigrant communities. Whispered tales of women who had given birth on Blackwell's Island, but whose children had vanished without trace. Rumors of healthy babies being sold to wealthy families, while their mothers grieved for children they were told had died. These stories were dismissed by authorities as the fantasies of unstable women or the gossip of superstitious communities. No official investigation was ever conducted. The women who had experienced the horrors of the ward firsthand found their testimonies ignored or discredited. What happened to the children who survived Dr. Whitmore's operation remains one of history's most troubling mysteries. Conservative estimates suggest that over 200 babies were sold to wealthy families during the ward's 5-year operation. These children would have grown up never knowing their true origins, raised by families who believed they were participating in legitimate adoptions. Some may have lived full, happy lives, never learning the dark circumstances of their birth. Others may have struggled with questions of identity and belonging that they could never fully understand. All of them were denied the fundamental human right to know their true parentage. The mothers, meanwhile, carried their grief in silence. Without birth certificates or official records, they had no proof their children had ever existed. Society offered them no support for their loss, no recognition of their trauma. They were expected to disappear back into the shadows from which they had emerged. Dr. Morrison's journal provides us with names and details that official records omit. Through her eyes, we see not statistics or case studies, but individual human beings whose lives were forever altered by their encounter with institutional cruelty. Mary O'Sullivan returned to her boarding house after losing her child and was found dead 3 weeks later, having consumed a lethal dose of rat poison. Elizabeth Romano disappeared entirely, with no records of her existence after her discharge from the hospital. Sarah Washington was found wandering the streets of Manhattan months later, her mind apparently broken by her experience. These were not isolated tragedies. They were the predictable consequences of a system that treated vulnerable women as disposable and their children as commodities. The physical evidence of the ward's crimes disappeared along with Dr. Whitmore. When the maternity ward was officially closed, all equipment and records were reportedly destroyed in a fire that city officials claimed was accidental. The basement rooms Dr. Morrison had discovered were sealed and eventually forgotten as the hospital underwent renovations. Dr. Whitmore himself retired to a comfortable estate in Connecticut, where he lived quietly until his death in 1912. His obituary praised him as a dedicated physician who had served the city's most disadvantaged populations. There was no mention of the unmarked ward or the children who had vanished under his care. It would be nearly a century before the truth began to emerge. When Dr. Morrison's journal was discovered and authenticated in 1987, historians finally had documentary evidence of what had occurred on Blackwell's Island. The journal sparked renewed interest in the hospital's history and led to the discovery of additional evidence in city archives. Forensic investigators who examined the former hospital site in 1992 made a chilling discovery. Buried beneath what had once been the basement ward, they found the skeletal remains of 19 infants. Carbon dating confirmed that the remains dated to the 1880s and 1890s. Each skeleton showed evidence of trauma consistent with deliberate killing. The discovery confirmed Dr. Morrison's darkest suspicions. Not all of the babies had been sold. Some had been murdered outright, their tiny bodies disposed of with the same callous efficiency that characterized the entire operation. What's your theory about how many other hospitals might have operated similar schemes during this era? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Today, the site where Blackwell's Island Hospital once stood is home to a small memorial park. A brass plaque commemorates the patients and staff who served here, but makes no specific mention of the maternity ward or its victims. Most visitors to the island remain unaware of the dark history that lies beneath their feet. The 19 infant skeletons found in 1992 were given proper burial in a small ceremony attended by historians and descendants of some of the women who had been patients in the ward. It was perhaps the closest thing to justice that the victims would ever receive. But justice delayed is justice denied, and the broader implications of what occurred in that unmarked ward extend far beyond the specific crimes of Dr. Whitmore and his associates. The case represents a systematic failure of institutions that were supposed to protect the most vulnerable members of society.
The women who gave birth in the ward were vulnerable because they were poor, unmarried, and often immigrants. They lacked the social connections and legal protections that would have allowed them to challenge the system that exploited them. Society had already marked them as outcasts before they ever set foot on Blackwell's Island. Their children were vulnerable simply by virtue of being born to these women. In a society that viewed illegitimate birth as a moral stain, these infants were considered problems to be solved rather than lives to be protected. Their lack of legal status made them perfect victims for Dr. Whitmore's schemes. The medical profession failed them by prioritizing profit over patient welfare. The legal system failed them by refusing to investigate credible reports of abuse. Society as a whole failed them by creating conditions where such exploitation was possible and profitable. These failures were not unique to one hospital or one city. Similar patterns of abuse existed in institutions across the country, from orphanages that sold children to poorhouses that worked inmates to death. The Blackwell's Island maternity ward was part of a larger system of institutional cruelty that targeted society's most powerless members. The story of the unmarked ward also raises uncomfortable questions about historical memory and whose stories get preserved. For nearly a century, the official narrative ignored the experiences of the women and children who suffered there. Their voices were silenced not just by death, but by a deliberate effort to erase evidence of their exploitation. It was only through the chance discovery of Dr. Morrison's journal that the truth finally emerged. How many other similar atrocities remain hidden in forgotten archives or sealed basement rooms? How many victims of institutional abuse will never receive recognition or justice? The babies born in that ward between 1889 and 1894 would be well over a century old today if they had lived. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren may be walking among us unaware of the dark circumstances that brought their ancestors into the world. Some families may carry unexplained gaps in their genealogy, mysteries that now have a potential explanation. For the descendants of the women who suffered in the ward, the discovery of Dr. Morrison's journal provided both answers and new questions. Learning the truth about their ancestors' experiences offered validation of family stories that had been dismissed as fantasy or shame, but it also opened old wounds and raised questions about identity and belonging that may never be fully resolved. The story of Blackwell's Island Hospital's maternity ward serves as a reminder that progress is neither inevitable nor irreversible. The medical advances and ethical safeguards that we take for granted today were hard-won through the struggles of people like Dr. Morrison, who risked their careers and lives to expose institutional wrongdoing. It also reminds us that vulnerability is often invisible. The women who gave birth in that ward did not choose their circumstances any more than their children chose to be born into them. They were victims of larger social and economic forces that left them with few options and fewer protections. Today, as we grapple with ongoing questions about medical ethics, reproductive rights, and the treatment of vulnerable populations, the story of Blackwell's Island offers sobering lessons. It shows us how quickly institutions designed to heal can become instruments of exploitation when proper oversight and accountability are absent. The memorial plaque on what was once Blackwell's Island speaks of service and sacrifice, but it tells only part of the story. The complete truth includes not just those who served, but those who suffered, not just those who healed, but those who were harmed. Dr. Helena Morrison risked everything to document the truth about what happened in that ward. Her courage in recording these events, even knowing the personal cost, ensured that the victims would not be completely forgotten. Her journal stands as both an indictment of institutional cruelty and a testament to individual conscience. The women who gave birth in the unmarked ward may never have received the justice they deserved in their lifetimes. Their children may never know their true stories, but their experiences are now part of the historical record, a permanent reminder of the human cost of unchecked power and institutional indifference. In the end, the ward where no birth certificates were ever issued represents more than just a single instance of medical malpractice. It represents a fundamental failure of human compassion, a systematic denial of dignity to those society deemed unworthy of protection. The question that haunts us is not just how such things could have happened, but how we can ensure they never happen again. In a world where vulnerable populations still face exploitation and neglect, the story of Blackwell's Island remains uncomfortably relevant. As we close this chapter of forgotten history, we must ask ourselves, what other dark secrets lie buried in the foundations of institutions we trust? And when we discover them, will we have the courage to face the truth no matter how uncomfortable it makes us? If this story disturbed you as much as it did me while researching it, hit that notification bell, because the darkest chapters of medical history are often the ones we need to remember most.